So we're going right into now a high-level dialogue of development partners on the just transition in Africa, the just energy transition in Africa. I'm going to call up my panelists, and then we are going to look to the audience and to the panelists to decide what it is we want to get out of this next discussion, mindful of the topics that you've already sat through. So I know most of my panelists are here. Dr. Hanan Morsi, Deputy Executive Secretary and Chief Economist, United Nations Economic Commission for Africa. Ms. Ahuna Izia-Konwa, Assistant Administrator, apologies, I should have said Assistant Secretary General, then Assistant Administrator, Regional Director for Africa, United Nations Development Program. Professor Kevin Urama, you see him right there, he's Acting Chief Economist and Vice President of the African Development Bank. Dr. Marit Kitao, who is the Interim Director of the African Minerals Development Center, African Union Commission. We are also joined by Richard Munang, the Africa Regional Climate Change Coordinator of the UN Environmental Program. He will be joining us online, so we'll keep an eye out for him. And Dr. Victoria Kwakwa, the World Bank Vice President for Eastern and Southern Africa. Just a call out to Dr. Victoria Kwakwa. If you are in the room, please come up to the stage. I'm going to start there and bring this to Marit. If I say those things that we have been tasked to cover, we've heard the conversation to this point, where do we take this conversation to make sure that it resonates with our audience, who are actually the reason we are here today, notwithstanding that we also have a high audience online. So, Marit, to you.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. And I want to thank the organizers for inviting the African Union Commission. I'm representing Commissioner Muchanga of AU, Economic Development, Trade, Tourism, Industry, and Minerals. I heard the conversation this morning with very much interest. And we are specifically asked to talk about the just energy transition. As you know, Africa has been paying for what others have done with regards to climate change. And then we are asked to have climate smart development, which is real, but we do have our own development trajectory. On the typologies of the just energy transition, also we have renewables, of course, electric, we have the solar panels, we have wind, we have hydroelectric, geothermal, and we have nuclear as well. And COP27 was pushing around this nuclear as well on Africa, on everyone. So we have this typology, but what is it for Africa? We have to think about ours. And I like the way that was presented. We need a new paradigm. We need a new thinking, new models. Has this benefited Africa? I come from the African Minerals Development Center, so it resonated to me when they talked about minerals. So when you see from the minerals perspective, the decarbonization agenda needs a lot of minerals. We call them, in Africa, we call them strategic minerals or green minerals. In the global world, they call them critical raw materials because they need them for their industries, for their own, and it has to do with the supply, the rarity, etc. Africa, we have most of them. If we talk specifically about electric vehicles, batteries, and some of my colleagues alluded to, we have lithium, we have cobalt, especially DRC has 70% production of cobalt. Lithium is Zimbabwe has it, others have it. Graphite, Mozambique, manganese, South Africa, and nickel also is there. The point we're trying to make is we have to define our own trajectory for this just energy transition, and we have to see it from a holistic point of view. What is it the cost-benefit analysis should not be just about the monies, and we heard about the financing, but what does it benefit our people? We have the right to develop as well.
And perhaps I can just pause there for a moment, because I want to pick up on what Professor Kevin said earlier. Use what we have to get what we want. Does that surmise what we're trying to say here?
Yes, because we need to industrialize as well, because without industrialization, there is no structural transformation. But we have to be smart about the industrialization. And that industrialization has to be in the terms of African countries. And we cannot use the model of, it was mentioned, the model of
debt,
the New Deal. And I'm going back again to this comparative advantage. Africa was relegated to just exporting raw materials in this helm of comparative advantage. But we have to be bold now, and I'm referring to a real concrete study that was commissioned by Economic Commission for Africa, African Development Bank, Afreximbank, etc., by Bloomberg, that shows that there's costs, there's actually cost and emissions advantage of having precursors, like adding value to minerals on our continent. So this comparative advantage, we have it now as a competitive advantage for having industries in our countries.
100%, and we should also be leveraging the African Continental Free Trade Area to ensure that beneficiation happens at both a regional and a continental level. Huna, I'm going to come to you, and if you can give me your thoughts on taking the discussion further. In fact, perhaps it's about defining what we want to achieve with this dialogue now on stage. We, as I said, have been tasked with a dialogue with development partners. What should be the outcome, Ahuna, of this conversation for us?
Yeah, I think very interesting previous session. I think a lot came out of that, and we need to sort of take that forward. What should we be looking at achieving? The first is someone actually in the previous panel talked about resetting globalization. I think we need to reset, or at least use this platform and this conversation to drive home a message of the need to reset multilateralism. Today, with all the crises, global crises that we're seeing in the world, one of the things that's taking a hit is multilateralism. It is shrinking at a time when we actually need a collective to see the crisis as a collective responsibility and address them as such. We're seeing a shrinking of that multilateral space. So can we achieve that, to have a very clear message that we need to rescue multilateralism, not only rescue it, but also reset it so that it reflects the key word that we're using here, just transitions. It reflects justice, and that's the key word. We need to underline also as a message from this conversation that we're not talking about charity and handouts to African countries. We're talking about justice. And there were lots of comments about the polluter pays principle. And when we think about just energy transitions, the first principle is that on the continent of Africa, you still have 600 million people who don't have access to electricity. And it is an SDG, by the way, which all member states have signed up to. So the first principle is ensuring.
If I can add, Ahuna, because that's a great stat, I think we need to also add the context that that is 80% of the global population that doesn't have access to energy.
Absolutely.
That's 600 million.
So justice means, first of all, that we assure energy for that population. Accessibility, and affordability. And of course, cleaner. The second principle, I think, is that we have 900 million people right now in Africa that need to transition from biomass, particularly cooking energy that is killing women and stifling opportunity for the younger generation. This transition must happen. We have for decades invested in efforts on biofuels, never achieved it. Why? This is a low-hanging fruit here that one could invest in. How do we make that transition? The third, you talked about green energy, green hydrogen, and all of that. Abundance of this in Africa, we're discovering now, from Namibia to Mauritania to Gabon. And one of the things that we should sign up for as a compact is that we don't preside over yet another extractive industry in this area, where nations who need that material come to Africa, extract it, leave a damage in terms of the environment. Look at what's happened in the fossil fuel industry. You go extract, you damage the environment, leave that dirty air for the local population and leave them in the dark. This has happened in my own country, Nigeria. This should not be allowed to be the fate of the green gas discoveries. If green hydrogen is the long-term answer to decarbonization, if it is found in Namibia, Namibians should be the first to benefit from that dividend. And then, of course, if it is exported, it should be exported at a fair price that then comes back to power industry. And I think lastly, let me talk about carbon. Everyone talked about carbon. Africa has the deepest carbon sinks. The market price for carbon is, let's say, embarrassing in terms of talking about just. There's nothing just about it. This is an area that could help power Africa's industry in terms of financing that is required for that industry. But the unfair pricing, the confusion, the complexity that is deliberately posed in this area continues to limit the continent's ability to leverage this deep carbon sink. So I think if we're talking justice, really, these are some of the things that we need to address. And that net zero also means zero poverty. If you think that defunding development for those who need it most is going to help us save the planet, you can forget about it. Because addressing poverty at its core is part and parcel of the journey to net zero.
And I think President Adesina, President of the African Development Bank, says it very well in that we need to transition from something as Africa. We have nothing to transition from on most of the continent at the moment. So the developmental objective is critical, as Ahuna has said. I'm going to bring Richard Munang into the conversation. He's online. Richard, good to see you again. Richard is the Africa Regional Climate Change Coordinator of the UN Environmental Programme. And Richard, I know you're very passionate in this arena. You've jumped into this conversation. I hope you were privy to the conversations before as well. But we are working towards what conclusion we can leave our audience with today, given the discussion that has already taken place. We're now looking at issues of beneficiation. We're looking at just transition. We're looking at the carbon credit environment, which doesn't make any sense for emerging markets. In fact, Kevin said it very well. The biggest emitters are actually being rewarded for emitting. That's how the system works. So it doesn't make any sense. Richard, jump in here. You are the expert in this space.
Thank you very much for having me, and accept greetings from the United Nations Environment Programme. Accept greetings from our executive director, who's currently at the COP15 in Montreal for UN Biodiversity Conference. The discussion is quite very, very interesting. Let me start with this point. The context of Africa cannot be discussed the same way other regions in the world are discussed. Why? Africa's context is an informal context, and that have an advantage to it to an extent. So the informality of the continent when it comes to just transition need to take center stage. 84% of the entire continent that don't have access to electricity is in rural areas. That then means when we talk about just transition in this aspect, and I think Ahuna put it very nicely, it's about justice, but I'll add three aspects. It's about equity, it's about socio-economic inclusivity, and it's also about competitive economic growth. What does that mean? It means the discussion around gas, the discussion around carbon, the discussion cannot miss the fact that the people at that level in rural communities need access to electricity, and that electricity needs to be off-grid. they need access to clean cooking, but that clean cooking needs to also be about solutions that can actually be turned into opportunities, tapping into the informal sector and young people. And this means focusing on low-hanging fruits, like turning agricultural waste into fuel briquettes that can tap into the 20 billion charcoal market. This is something that is happening, but it's not happening at scale. How can we incentivize financial institutions, but more importantly, looking at what is accessible to the informal sector, in this case, communal cooperatives. Where I come from in Cameroon, we call them Jangis. In East Africa, they call them Chamas and have different names across the continent. But this is not taking center stage in this discussion. The second aspect that I think is very, very important, you can only leverage from a position of strength, and Africa's strength is her youth. But the discussion sometimes bringing youth as a footnote rather than a head note. Youth are not anybody's name, but it's an age group. They are vibrant, energetic, innovative. So leveraging their abilities through skills retooling so they can be part and parcel of this energy transition narrative becomes important. And the third aspect that I think is very, very crucial here is that the narrative needs to be reshaped. And that narrative cannot be reshaped from borrowed narrative, but it needs to be an African narrative. And the narrative is, we're talking about energy transition, then we talk about gas, but it's mostly for export. We cannot be talking about gas for export. It should be gas for leveraging to address Africa's challenges. And in this case, what is more accessible is looking at biogas, briquettes made from waste, and at the same time leveraging the proceeds that come from even the gas itself to inject in expanding our agro value chain, adding value so we can reverse the 48 billion US dollars that actually happens as a result of post-harvest losses. Without contextualizing this within the informality of Africa, the discussion can be sweet, but we might not be able to bring everyone on board. Over.
Richard, I like the fact that you bring in the youth, and further that you talk to the fact that the narrative has to change. But I would go one step further than that and say the narrative has changed. We have the answers. We know what the solutions are. It's really now about the implementation. And I think it's going to come back to the finance, because what is the backbone of changing the conversation completely? I am coming to you, Kevin, because I've got so many questions for you. But Hanan, we need to hear from you in this regard. And again, we're building to the solutions. We know the challenges. We've already tabled a number of solutions around the table. Dr. Morsi.
Thank you. I think maybe I'd like to just start by giving a bit of context to what we're talking about here. We're talking about Africa with a population of 17% of the global population and emissions of 3%. We're talking about a huge energy deficit, okay, that we have 600 million people out of 800 million globally that don't have access to electricity. That's 80% of the global population, as you have indicated. We have also 40% that don't have access to clean cooking energy. So as a part of development and transition, addressing that energy gap is crucial. You cannot go around it. That's core and parcel of just moving forward, both in transition as well as in development. What we are discussing then is, okay, how, first of all, the transition needs to be country specific. And for those that actually have gas, that can be, a component of that transition, because there are many advantages to that. For example, also on this issue of the energy gap, currently the continent electricity generation capacity is 250 gigawatts. Okay, compare that to the capacity in China for similar population. In China, it's 2,000 gigawatts. Okay, so we're almost 10% of China with the same population, and we have 3 times bigger in terms of land mass. So we have a long way to go. And if we were to use gas to generate electricity, to double our capacity, generation capacity for electricity, that would only increase emissions by 1% increase to global emissions. So the the increase in terms of emissions relative to the benefits of using natural gas to actually close that.
It's very clear that natural gas needs to form part of our transition fuel story. That's it.
Exactly. And also it's very useful for other things that we are suffering from, like the issue of the clean energy for cooking. That's a core and parcel. Not only this, but also it has the advantage of being able to be repurposed for green hydrogen production later on. So this can be definitely part of that solution. And also in terms of the financing, we've talked all day about the needs of the continent. We have said earlier that the continent needs $3 trillion by 2030 to meet the NDCs for implementation requirements for financing. But this will require a whole set of financing resources. We have talked earlier about issues of carbon credit. I think this cannot be emphasized enough because for the continent to actually offer a substantial part of the solution, Congo Basin has the capacity of sequestering a third of global needs. And if the continent were to actually be properly compensated, fairly compensated for carbon credit, that will avail a huge amount of financing that can actually be used to support the continent for both adaptation and mitigation. So that's a core part, and not only the pricing, by the way, but also regulatory changes for big countries like the US and like the European Union to allow actually the exchange of these carbon credits across the board. But also we need to have, for example, we've talked earlier about credit for nature and credit for climate swaps. I think this is important in a way that it can offer a way to refinance at cheaper rates that you can then use that differential to actually address climate action needs.
I want to unpack some of these topics in a little bit more detail across the panel, because I think we really need to solve for them. And I think you've highlighted the context very, very well. Dr. Kwakwa, I'm going to bring you in here and get your sense of how we take things further from your perspective. We haven't heard from you today, so perhaps you want to just give us a sense of where you're going to take this conversation for us.
Well, thank you very much, and sincere apologies for coming in a little bit late, but really delighted to join this conversation. Just wanted to say as we start that if you look at the energy mix in Africa today, it is already 76% renewables. So I think what I've heard other panelists say, the focus on access is really the important thing. So you can't talk about a just energy transition for a continent that's already at 75% renewables, but has about half or more than half without access. You can't talk about that without talking about achieving the access goal. So just wanted to affirm that. Let me add a little bit to what needs to be done to get us to the access that we're looking at. I think first, you need a fundamental shift in how we do things. Right now, the way that we're going is a bit piecemeal approach. ADB does a project, the World Bank does a project, UNDP supports, and it's a bit fragmented. We need to make a fundamental shift away from the piecemeal approach.
But sorry, Dr. Kwakwa, isn't that what we're doing here is actually unifying voices? Because I think
but it has to go beyond unifying voices. It's actually when you're
this is what we're wanting.
Exactly. So that's what I'm saying. We need to all come together, but have larger scale, longer term programmatic approaches. See that this is not just about one project, but it's about a longer term engagement to get us all there. And so that is a fundamental change that needs to come in how we're approaching this issue. I think you're also going to recognize that
the private sector will have to be a big part of this, and it's not going to be just on-grid solutions. For countries that are as large as DRC and even countries like Madagascar, just the size of the country makes it very expensive to go with just grid solutions. You're going to need off-grid solutions. You're going to need to crowd in the private sector to be able to do that. We're beginning to see that happen in several countries, in DRC, in Tanzania, and we need to continue to do more on that. But there's a responsibility on the parts of government to create the enabling environment, the right policy and regulatory framework that allows the private sector to come in and play the role that they need to play. So just wanted to make a few points on that score, because it's really important. Now, the other thing that I wanted to say is, again, coming to the financing, we need about 200 billion to get the 500 or 600 million that don't have access, to get them access. We need about that much. It can't come from the public sector alone. So you need public resources to be used very strategically where it needs to be used to catalyze private funding to come in. And you need, again, partnerships coming together. I want to give the example of what's happening in South Africa. South Africa is a bit of a different situation because it's really there about the transition from coal-based to renewables. Currently, 74% of South Africa's energy mix is coal. It's in South Africa's own interest and the viability of its energy sector to transition away from coal to renewables. But that's going to cost a lot of money. It needs everybody to come together. And it's just started a project to close its first coal-fired power plant. A part of that is being financed through the World Bank, IBRD resources, catalyzing grant resources or concessional resources from Canadians and coming together at more affordable terms for South Africa.
So, Dr. Kwakwa, I need to, being South African, and the fact that we're on stage 8, load shedding, right now in the country, and it seems to be going to stage 12. I'm not sure what that means, complete darkness forever.
Yes.
This comes to a very important point, is that we need to have energy while we're doing the transition. Otherwise, maybe I would go back to opening up that coal-fired plant, to be honest.
Yeah,
so
sure.
I want to go back to what Ahuna said, is that net zero means net poverty. And net poverty means energy provision for everybody across the African continent. I now want to come back to Kevin, and let's talk about the elephant in the room. You started that conversation. You said that climate finance, the way it is structured, is set to fail. Now, for me, having just come from COP27, that for me was a bombshell, and I'm kind of saying, well, does the conversation need to go beyond that? If we cannot sort this out, where do we go? So I understand that there are other issues beyond finance. We spoke about political will, we spoke about beneficiation, we've spoken about the carbon credit environment. Kevin, you put the problem on the table. I now want to see the solution.
Okay, thank you very much. When we talk about just energy transitions, I always like to think like I used to think when I was in primary school. Definitions. I'll come to answer that question, but there are some points I want to clarify in terms of how we want to change that narrative about just energy transitions in Africa. We have 3 words there: just, my sister has talked about justice, energy, and then transitions. Now, first, the principles of justice as it applies to climate change, we need to think about moral justice. I've told the story about my neighbor polluting my house and having to have the moral responsibility to clean up. Distributive justice, in terms of the carbon budget of the world, I am a citizen of the world, of the planet, just as you are. So you should be entitled to the same amount of CO2 emissions, just as I am. And as I've given you the statistics, Africa still has a lot of headroom with regard to per capita emissions required to meet the climate goals that we've all agreed to. Then there's also criminal justice. In case of when my actions creates a problem for you that actually I need to be put in jail. if I don't address that problem that I have created.
Instead of lending you money.
Yes, so we need to think about these three principles of justice as we research and think about how we respond to the issue about just energy transitions. Now, when I talk about energy, we've already all talked about it. We don't have energy. So we need energy before we can start transitioning. So, and the question now is, how do we get our energy in a way that we don't rapidly use up that carbon headroom that we have, and then go to the level of those who are creating the problems that we need to catch with moral justice, distributive justice, or criminal justice. So that's another point I want to make there. Then the context of transition means transition, moving from here to there. So we need to be sure that when we are talking transition in Africa, we're not just thinking about, oh, once we have energy transition, people think about solar panels. That's not what it means. It means the path of journey that you need to take as a country to remain within your carbon budget. And that could include any technology that allows you to remain within that carbon budget. And so long as you can do that constrained optimization, you're good.
I think the example, before you go on, because I want to pick on the solar panels, the example that you shared earlier also resonated. That is, you said the example of solar panels. We feel, put some solar panels up, we import them from China, and we have solved the energy crisis in a renewable way. But the reality is, you said, the carbon footprint of the solar panel from the continent to China and then back again. Greenwashing.
So that's another side of the issues that we really need to think about. And this is why COP27 agreement enshrined this principle of common but differentiated responsibilities for meeting those carbon goals, knowing that we are at different levels of responsibility in this constrained optimization we all have to do. So we need to think about that common but differentiated responsibilities also. And this is where the financing question you talk about comes in, because that responsibility of my neighbor is either you come and clean up the mess you created in my backyard yourself, or you pay a laborer to come and do it. But for us to remain good neighbors, that mess needs to be cleaned up. So the easiest way for the developed countries to demonstrate moral, distributive justice, I won't say criminal justice, because some of these things were caused by people who are no longer here, is actually to pay for that cleanup. And that is where the whole principle of climate finance comes in. So transition means moving from one place to the other. Africa cannot move from 0 to 0.
As President Adesina has repeatedly said.
Because sustainable poverty is not sustainable development. Actually, my research does show me, right from my PhD, that poverty engenders environmental degradation. And a lot of the CO2 emissions from Africa is from their follow sector: agriculture, forestry, and land use. You already know what it is. Bad equipment for agriculture, low productivity, a lot of land expansion, so we're cutting down the trees, which are the lungs of the planet. Deforestation, we have to cut down the trees to cook our food. And then our mothers and children are dying because of indoor air pollution. So it's not good for the economy, it's not good for the environment, it's not good for anyone. And then we find that wherever you look at it, the way that we are relating or trying to de-link poverty alleviation and development from climate is not good for anyone.
So Kevin, let me ask you, COP27, we got closer to the loss and damage funding being a reality. It's not yet a reality. It's now going to be tabled at COP28. As I said earlier, we have to decide who's going to put the money in there, and hopefully it's the developed world. The 100 billion we've been waiting the last 10 years for. And we also need to know how that is distributed. So with the analysis that you've done and the fact that we're close to that damage and loss funding, isn't that the golden egg? How do we take that further?
Yes, we need to take that further in basically different ways. But let me finish the line of thought and then I come to that. Now, to be able to do that just transition, we need 5 things. knowledge, how to do it. How do we ensure that our energy mix going forward is not going to mimic what the rest of the world have done that created the problem? And it is in our interest to do that because market shifts, technology shifts, and policy shifts will force green energy for the future. So we shouldn't create asset stranding risks for ourselves by trying to insist, I have oil, so I have to use oil. I have coal, so I have to use coal. You develop your coal power plant, it has 30, 50 years lifeline, and then financing will not come, the demand is not there. Basically, you have stranded assets. So let's think about that. It needs time, and we need to also be able to understand that it's not turning off a switch. A transition means going from here to there, so it's a journey. So long as you have that determination and political will we have heard about to remain within your carbon budget and have an energy mix that allows you to remain within that carbon budget, be bold and candid enough to have that discussion that this is what you need to do. We need to understand what our carbon budgets are for each country. And we've done that analysis at the African Development Bank Group. We have country-focused reports for each country on this continent to understand what that means. So we need technology, and that technology is not consuming it, like buying solar panels that I've talked about. We need to be able to start developing those technologies within the continent. 2011, I had a program I launched, which I called Youth Innovation Challenge in Africa, Why I Can Program. I was blown away with climate smart technologies that youth of Africa and girls of Africa were coming up with. We need the private sector to invest in those youths. We don't need the private sector to invest in importing solar panels for us,
so
because
Professor,
they can develop
very hard on all the other panelists. And
Yeah?
it would be very unfair
Yeah.
of me to not allow you to get away with answering my question when I've interjected everywhere else. So we are at point 3, sir. And
Yeah.
I want to come back to my climate question. And I also want to say, with all due respect, we have discussed that knowledge is critical. We
Yeah.
have discussed that time. We've said over and over again, we need time to make the transition.
Yeah.
We can't transition from 0 to 0. We
Yeah.
said that. Technology, we know, is the solution, and there is amazing technology out there. So there are another 2 points that you want to make. You can make it in 1 minute, and then you can tell me about the climate finance, and then I'm going back
Okay.
to my panelists. Thank you.
So in 1 minute, for me, we then need the finance and we need institutions and markets. And those institutions and markets is created by us. The incentive systems that you have as a government defines the shape of the institutions you have, and that defines the rules in the market and also the levels of competition and attraction of financing into your countries. Let's think about that. But one key point on just transition is that if you look at history, where we're coming from on the climate discussion, natural gas and nuclear have been the best 2 technologies that allows countries to transition from coal. So that simply tells me that for us, if we are climate lovers, we need to make sure that natural gas is part of the equation, because that's the only way we have seen so far. Renewables is a good technology, but it's not technologically there yet to drive industrialization and also other poverty alleviation goals. So empirical evidence is telling us that we need that gas.
So natural gas, again, we need to stop flaring it in Nigeria because it is actually a very, very valuable resource.
Yes.
Climate finance, sir.
Then on climate finance, there are several ways that Africa can actually mobilize climate finance at scale. My sister has raised one of that, which is enabling the private sector. Or if we continue to focus on climate negotiations, we're just going to discuss for another 27 more years and nothing really will happen. So we need to find smart technologies to incentivize the private sector to see the climate opportunities in our continent, in the minerals sector, in the energy sector, in agriculture, and in all these key sectors, and invest in them big time. Again, that goes back to institutions, regulations, and policies. And again, Africa has a lot. You talked about it, my colleague from the African Union Commission, green minerals on this continent. So how we relate with and use that green minerals, if we flip our relationship with the global markets and start bringing investments into the continent to develop those green minerals, we will be able to mobilize much more resources than we need for the green transitions. And then the other one is an unusual candidate, public financial management. In Africa, we lose about $90 billion annually on illicit financial flows. Again, weak regulations, weak institutions, enabling corruption and other things to happen. So can you imagine if we just plug that hole? We already have 90 billion. And we need and we need only 108 billion. So the ways are very clear.
And then Mauritius wants to come in as well. Okay,
yep. On finance, if I may. You know, I think my sister Victoria said something important, which is that Africa is already at 75% renewable. One of the questions here is do we have the political will? I actually think this continent, leaders on this continent have the political will. You only need to look at our NDCs, how ambitious they are. African countries are the first to tell you that we do need to decarbonize and that the future in terms of development is a net zero future. So we're not lacking in political will. I agree with the private sector entry, but I think it's very difficult, even in the best enabling regulations the governments could front, for private sector to be effective in this space without de-risking capital. So we need to, when we talk about finance, we cannot avoid this principle that those rich countries need to put money in a pot, significant amounts of money beyond the 100 billion that can help crowd in private sector and de-risk the environment. We need that capital. Otherwise, it's a non-starter because private sector comes to make money. And frankly, the space is too complex, too disabling for them to be able to advance. So where is that money going to come from? So back to climate finance.
Aren't grants the answer that we're looking for? Because
grants, cheaper money, because right now African countries are borrowing to deal with climate change. That in itself is unjust, right?
Just so sorry, I need to run on this private sector point. Is that the private sector is only going to put money into bankable, de-risked projects. I mean, we know, for instance, you cannot get your money out of Nigeria, no matter what you do right now. So the reality is that money goes where money is welcome. And in many territories across the African continent, we don't have money that is welcome. So we understand the private sector needs to come to the party, but isn't the solution here granting? Shouldn't that what we be focusing in? Grants, 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 rather than anything else. I want your response there.
Yeah, he has an answer.
Yes.
You have an answer there. Mauritius is waiting to go.
I think your grants and grants and grants is a good way to go, but no country actually has developed with grants alone. The point that
growth beyond aid,
yes,
100%.
The point that Victoria made is crucial, which is those grants that are mobilized by public sector institutions should be used to de-risk the environment so that the private sector can come in. I'm just coming from Morocco, where under the leadership of President Adesina, we were able to mobilize $8.9 billion for countries facing fragility on the continent. How that money is used to unlock the private sector is crucial. And that's why we're saying the public sector needs to focus on that enabling environment for the private sector to come in.
100%. And you closed the last mile there. Of course, the grants need to be used to develop. I'm not saying that the grants should go into corrupt politicians' pockets. Marit, would you like to go for it?
Yes, just on that point about the private sector. Exactly as was saying, there needs to be incentives for the private sector to come, but there is perception of risk of Africa that we pay the high risk premium for, perceived or not, it's a perception. So specifically for the energy sector, and particularly, again, I'm coming to the mineral sector, we need to really de-risk that environment. And if you want value to accrue to Africa, we really need African investors. And for that, actually, the public sector is important. We need to, of course, have the policies, et cetera, but we need to also empower our local African investors. And to do that, it's very capital intensive. So we don't need, I don't believe we need grants at this point. From whom? I mean, but we need money, liquidity, and that African minerals, there is something called AMREC, Africa Minerals Energy and Resource Classification, that is actually getting value for our minerals on the market. We still don't have the commodities exchange to do that, but we are building on it. So what we need is capitals to be invested back to our own African investors. But on another issue, sorry, yeah. I really like the net zero doesn't mean net poverty. That's I was really hinting at by saying that we of course we all understand that climate change is an imperative. We all understand that. But when you go to our African countries and you see the women without any kind of access to energy, and all of those things, and then we know that it's this unjust, the unfairness of it. You think about development and how to do that. We need to see it from a holistic perspective. And when we talk about these modelings of, I was saying, when we see this typology of all these energy mixes from gas. Gas is still, unfortunately, in the equation because at this time, renewable energy, solar panels are not commercially viable. I mean, you can use them to light a bulb. I know I'm being a bit extreme, but you can't use them for power that needs to be for industrialization, to power our development.
We are pulling back to natural gas. Victoria is about to jump out of her seat right now.
No, I'm not saying that. It's just a transition. It's being practical. This is the day. I mean, we are all ideologically against it, but this is reality. We need them. We need them, and we need that as a transition. I mean, if we are realistic, and of course, we are up to now 75% renewable, and we only use, but 600 million of our people don't have access to energy. So we need to change this paradigm anyway. So the point we're trying to make is, let's be smart about it. If we industrialize, we're still not there, but we decarbonize, we use those, and maybe that's the help we can get, the assistance from our companies, the private sector that are outside investing. Maybe the ESG standards, maybe we industrialize smartly. Then, not leapfrogging, I don't like that, but using a different way of industrializing.
Use what we have to get what we want.
Exactly.
That's a good way to look at industrialization. We are going to open to the audience. I just want to give you a time check right now. We will go for another 20 minutes. So we will get the mic around the audience. As Gerard said earlier, you can state your name, pose your question. Please keep it short and tight. And I'd like to see whether you think we're going in the right direction with this conversation. I do want Dr. Kwakwa to come in here. Dr. Kwakwa, Victoria.
No, I just wanted to make one point. I think on natural gas, I think the thing to watch is that you're not creating stranded assets down the line. So that's the only caveat I would put in there. But I want to come back to this issue of financing and what we've all said. We need concessional resources, we need grants. We see what's happening globally. Interest rates are rising, money is becoming more expensive. The reality is that grant resources are going to be harder to attract and to get. That's a reality. So we can sit here and talk about it, and yes, I agree. But I think I go back to the African governments and the issue of political will and better management. I think Africa, there's a lot that we can still do ourselves to get us where we want to go. I don't think the political leadership is there enough to leverage this fully. I don't think we've come to the limits of what we can do ourselves. And that's what I think is really important and needs to come in more and more into these conversations, because we've seen what's happened in terms of commitments on climate finance and what has materialized. It's just not there. So let's do what needs to be done, sort ourselves out, the institutions, the regulatory frameworks, addressing weak management of public expenditures. We're already seeing some countries doing very well. Rwanda, in just about 15 years, has gone from 6% to, I think, close to 60% of access, and they did it with determination, with a clear plan and a strategy and strong leadership. So it is possible. Yeah.
Thank you. What I want to actually comment on is the issue of finance, really the issue of crowding in private sector, which is very critical because in Africa, we have only 14% out of the total climate finance flowing to Africa from private sector, which is compared to 50% in other regions like Asia and Latin America. So to crowd in the private sector, one of the things that we need to do, blended finance. Second, de-risking, which we heard about, and de-risking can be through also providing guarantees, enhancing instruments, more equity investments. All these things are very important elements of how we need to crowd in the private sector. But also here, there is a critical role, and I think maybe being on this panel is very important to highlight, a critical role for multilateral development banks. This is where we need them to play even a bigger role. And that's why at the Economic Commission of Africa, we've been calling for recapitalization of regional MDBs to be able to really expand these tools for the private sector. We've been also calling for the rechanneling of the special drawing rights through MDBs to have this multiplier and leverage impact of the finance. And there has been also the new G20 capital adequacy framework report, which called to really maximize the utilization of capital in MDBs and to increase the risk taking on their balance sheets. And all these are part and parcel of how we can actually crowd in the private sector. Moreover, we've talked earlier, and I didn't get a chance to finish that, the issue of credit for nature and credit for climate swaps. This is very important for a reason that now, as we have heard from colleagues here, the cost of finance for the continent is much higher now and is likely to increase in the future, given the state of the global financial market. So actually being able to finance at more affordable prices is key. And that's what you can get actually through these credit for nature and credit for climate swaps. The issue is that the number of countries that have managed to do it have done it with actually the help of philanthropy. And this cannot continue as such. We need to move from the millions to billions. And that's beyond the role of just philanthropy. Here, we need actually the de-risking that we were talking about at grander scale. We need for big countries to provide guarantees. So actually, this can be possible to do these swaps at affordable rates for countries that are committed to actually invest that differential for climate action. So that's really key. But also here...
I need to just get Richard Munang to
sure.
come in.
A small finger, just to back you up, because I don't think we should let the World Bank get away with this. The multilateral financial institutions need to be reformed so that they understand their responsibility on a matter as big as this, because that is where we've seen failure in terms of the global financial system being able to step in a significant way to transform this financing environment. It's not just going to happen with governments becoming, strong institutions and leaders. We know, for instance, when COVID happened, we saw how the IMF stepped in. But guess where the SDRs went? Not to the countries that actually need the recovery. So there is something odd, something flawed about this global financial system and the governance of it. And that's one of the things that needs to be reset if we're gonna get the financing right.
And Victoria, if I may add on that one for the issue of the guarantees and so on, one of the solutions can actually be in the reform of the Resilience and Sustainability Trust Facility that the IMF introduced is to look into ways for that to be catalytic for financing for climate, and including also having, guarantees to support credit for climate or credit for nature swaps. So these are the type of things that we need to have catalytic and transformative finance for climate.
I think that is very, very appropriate and a great way to end this panel. So a just and inclusive energy transition. We have heard from Richard. Okay. So thank you very much to everybody. Again, a round of applause. They were dynamic. They really brought the game today.